We have got a barn burner on our hands with the Chicago Bears heading to Washington to take on the Commanders as 5.5 point dogs with a total at 44. This is Showdown coverage brought to you by sharpfootballanalysis.com. I'm your host, Adam Wilde, and before we jump to DraftKings, we want to remind you about some of our fantasy content, including insights, props, worksheets, and more by taking advantage of our fantasy packages available on the Sharp Football website. Right now, we're running a special code ANGLES for 15% off any fantasy package. The 15% off discount also extends to every package site-wide. Check it out on the podcast description or use the code ANGLES during checkout on the purchase page of the Sharp Football website. Let's get into the slate. All right, so we're going to find it difficult to get Bears into our lineups this week. It's almost a repeat of the Giants slate that we just talked about, where Justin Fields is similar to Daniel Jones. The only issue is that Justin Fields is 11,000, so it's going to be even tougher to get to him. But he's historically been one of the quarterbacks that we've been okay with that, breaking that rule that we discussed where you don't have to pair him with a receiver. Almost always you want to. Even on the Daniel Jones slate, I was talking about pairing Daniel Jones with Darren Waller just to get a little bit unique, because most of the optimizers were going to want to put Daniel Jones in there by himself, and that usually doesn't work out for optimal lineups. Kind of the same situation here, especially since Justin Fields is 11,000. The only caveat is that we got that really weird outlier last week of the Chicago Bears offense doing reasonably well, right? So it's going to be tough to. I think you can just pretty much go with the idea that the Chicago Bears are not going to replicate the success they had as passers last week. And with that being the case, it's going to be difficult to stack Justin Fields, especially at 11,000. You've got Terry McLaurin there at 10,200. Terry McLaurin's been a pretty solid option, but he's been he's contributed similarly to some of the other options in his wide receiver room, and he's just significantly more expensive. So he's somebody that we're going to include for sure, but not somebody that we're going to have to build lineups around. The next thing we have DJ Moore, 10,000. It's going to be a theme of the whole show. The Bears are just so expensive relative to Washington, who seems to have it figured out with Eric Bieniemy as their offensive coordinator. So you look at a guy like DJ Moore and you think, okay, well, yeah, he's gotten some involvement. He's obviously DJ Moore, 1,000-yard receiver, a handful of touchdowns every year. But at 10,000, when you're looking at Terry McLaurin's a perfect example. If we're going to be stacking Washington, why don't you just spend the extra 200 to get to McLaurin? Same deal. It's going to be when we get down to Robinson or Khalil Herbert. It's just going to be tough. So it's going to be a very typical build to see heavy Washington lineups. And so we're going to have to try to figure out how to get unique when we're building those lineups here soon. Sam Howell at 9,400 is a fantastic pick. His roster percentage isn't going to be too terribly egregious, but 9,400 is pretty cheap for Sam Howell, who's done some good things. I mean, we have seen a 4-interception game as well as a very good game last week. I think he had 3 touchdown passes. So I guess you've seen the best of both worlds for Sam Howell, just as you have with Justin Fields. But Sam Howell is just significantly cheaper in an offense that's a little bit hotter, playing at home, 5.5-point favorites. It just makes a little bit more sense to go with Sam Howell and then stack that offense. Brian Robinson had a good bit of involvement last week. He did quite well. He actually almost sealed the game for him. Maybe if they would have gone for 2, I don't know. There's a little hindsight bias there, but he did score the 15-yard touchdown there at the end of the game. So he's getting about 55% of the touches. We'll talk about Antonio Gibson here in a minute, who's only 3,200, and he's getting 35% of the running back touches. So Brian Robinson's not running away from the rest of the backfield. He's just doing much better. Antonio Gibson's still dealing with fumble issues this season, so that's been a reoccurring theme throughout his career. Khalil Herbert down there, 8,600, is doing a little bit better in his backfield rotation. He's about 70% or more of the touches, if I recall correctly. So that's really the workload that you're looking for typically. And he's a decent run back option at 8,600. You're talking about a back that could get involved in the passing game as well. So Khalil Herbert's definitely not off the board nearly as much as something like DJ Moore is, right? So, um, yeah, I guess you can get to Khalil Herbert and you can feel okay about it, but uh, you're mostly targeting those Washington Commanders above and below. Um, so, yeah, so you get to Jahan Dotson, right? Jahan Dotson at 7,000 is somebody that you can be excited about. You feel like you get the discount from Terry McLaurin, right? So Terry McLaurin is 10,200, and then you come down to Jahan Dotson at 7,000. You get a huge price discount and you get similar involvement in the offense. So Jahan Dotson is someone that you can like you can fit in, Sam Howell at captain and then Jahan Dotson and then Brian Robinson. And then you're still looking at like a Khalil Herbert or someone like that that you can feel good about as your run back if you want to do a 5-by-1, especially if you want to get the Washington Commanders defense involved. You can play Brian Robinson at captain and then, you just leave so much space by stacking Washington that it just makes so much more sense. And Jahan Dotson helps you do that and still get you get to have your cake and eat it too. I mean, you look at the fantasy point per game, and you kind of hope the field looks at the fantasy point per game, right? But they're getting similar snap shares. Jahan Dotson's a first round talent in his own right. As a matter of fact, Terry McLaurin technically wasn't a first round talent, but we know that he was far surpassed that. So that gets you to Cole Kmet there at 6,400, and just reoccurring theme of the whole show. Why would you go Cole Kmet when you could go Jahan Dotson? Why would you go Khalil Herbert when you could go Brian Robinson? And maybe you tell yourself this story that hey, since the field is going to be so heavily invested in Washington, I'm just going to go ahead and go heavy on the Chicago Bears. You can do that. The only problem with that, and the only reason that that's not something that I'd be preaching in this episode, is just how expensive they made Justin Fields. Like if they made Justin Fields a little cheaper and then the rest of the talent around him was like relatively expensive, you could still make the excuse that, hey, I'm just going to go heavily invested in Chicago because I know that Washington can blow it. I mean, I live in the Washington area. They've been doing it my whole life, right? So they're 5.5 point favorite doesn't really factor that much into my building as much as it does the pricing, just because their offense is projected to score more points and they're significantly cheaper relative to the projected volume. Go down here just a little bit. Curtis Samuel at 5,600, fair, right? Fair option. I think he scored a rushing touchdown last week, right? So he's been involved as much as you would expect him to be involved as like the jet sweep guy, as like the Mecole Hardman of the Chiefs. But now he's Eric Bieniemy's with Washington, kind of bringing some of the same schemes. It was cool to see that on Red Zone a few times, to see the Commanders and say, wait a second, I forgot they had Eric Bieniemy, and you knew that just from seeing the plays. I was able to be like, oh yeah, Eric Bieniemy, because being around Washington, you hadn't seen any creativity in quite some time. So it's clicking for them. There's a reason it's clicking. So it's not like last week with the Bears where we say, oh, maybe they could do that again. Well, that was kind of crazy. They haven't done that in a long time. Actually, that was Justin Fields' best passing performance of his young career. So it's really tough to hang your hat on that when you could just look at Washington and say, look, they've hung with some people. If Sam Howell didn't have that 3 interception game or 4 interception game, he'd probably be more expensive, and then we would be less excited about him. So I guess everything there happens for a reason. Commanders, obviously, defense pretty expensive, but you need to remember when you're running a 5-by-1, there's a really, really good chance that the defense for the winning team is going to be in that 5-by-1. The kicker, there's a really good chance that the defense and the kicker from the winning team are in that 5-by-1. When you do run a 5-by-1, you don't really want to consider the other team's kicker that often. I mean, if you're doing large field stuff, you might throw them in there, but it just feels terrible when your kicker hits a 50-yard bomb and then it drops your defense 3 points. It just doesn't feel great. So that's something I touch on a lot. Now we get into some value for the Bears, especially if you want to run those 5-by-1s and those 4-by-2s that don't include Justin Fields. Then you have to get just the random one-offs or two-offs from Chicago to go into your Washington stacks. Darnell Mooney is a good option. Roschon Johnson's a decent option as he's getting a little bit more involvement. I did mention earlier that Khalil Herbert had a good snap share, 70-ish%. So you're not getting a ton from Johnson, but Johnson's a pretty talented back. I think his first career game he passed 20 fantasy points, I'm pretty sure. Obviously that hasn't continued as his fantasy point per game down to like 8.3, but it doesn't matter. He flashed the ability, and that's why his price is 8,400 or 4,800 instead of down there with Antonio Gibson, who we're going to talk about in a moment. But Darnell Mooney, you get a situation where it's not quite the same as Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, but Darnell Mooney is the player who's been with the team the most. He's had a connection with Justin Fields. He's only 5,000. So you, especially those deep shot guys, those are the ones you want to include when you are playing in those large fields, and you need to figure out how can I differentiate when I have the most popular 4 players, because a lot of the times when you're stacking, when you're starting your lineups with 4 commanders, you're going to end up with the most popular 4 players of the slate. And so you need to figure out who 5 and 6 are going to be. That's going to differentiate your lineup and be less than 20% roster percentage. That's probably going to be your Mooney, your Johnson, guys like that. Even kickers in this game when the total's only 44. Sometimes you can get away with sliding a kicker in there and saving some roster percentage, but probably not. Both of these guys are going to be probably close to 30%. So you're not going to be able to really bank on them as being your low roster percentage guys, and then you're just hoping for a low scoring game. You're really going to have to try to figure out like if your Antonio Gibson's going to pay off. So Antonio Gibson at 3,200, he had a pretty decent snap share of like 35%. He had 8 opportunities last week. 8 opportunities is actually a lot for 3,200. You would think he wasn't quite involved enough to be in consideration, but he definitely was. You would think his involvement would go down because the fumbling has been an issue. He has some vision troubles at times. I do like Antonio Gibson, and I do think that there is talent there, but I don't know. I guess I'm just glad that they keep giving him opportunity because we've got him at a cheap salary this week. But it doesn't seem like he's progressing the offense too terribly much. Still makes sense at 3,200 though, especially when Brian Robinson's going to be so popular. If you make a lineup that doesn't include Brian Robinson, definitely give a little bit of a bump to Antonio Gibson as to whether you're going to play with him or not. You scroll down a little bit and you don't actually have that many viable punt options. I would say probably the only one is Jesse Bates, but even having said that, he still really isn't, even though he's 400 and he's got an okay snap share for 400. He's like Noah Gray, basically the same snap share, same involvement as Noah Gray, which makes sense because it's Eric Bieniemy's offense. But anyways, Logan Thomas came back this week and had like an 89% snap share. So Logan Thomas, actually, I missed Logan Thomas, is someone that I'm actually excited about for this game. So 5,200. Another situation where you go to click on Darnell Mooney and you're like, I could just add to my Washington stack. That's how you're going to land on so many 5x1s. And it's going to feel so gross because you're going to look at your 150 lineups that you built and you're going to say, how am I so invested in Washington? It's just pricing. It's just how it goes. So you're going to not get a ton of Darnell Mooney. You're going to have to like boost Darnell Mooney because you're just going to get a good bit of Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas is a really good option that we talked about earlier. Like we talked about Curtis Samuel and we talked about Jahan Dotson, and that they just let you do so much. You can have so many solid players if you just include Dotson, if you just include Thomas, include Samuel. And that's really what you want to do in Showdown, because like when you fill your lineup with just players that are going to accumulate a ton of volume, then all you're doing, instead of really rooting for your team, you're just rooting for the like big ticket players to fail. In this case, you're probably going to be rooting for Justin Fields to fail quite a bit because his roster percentage is going to be really high, even though he's 11,000, even though he doesn't really make sense from a construction standpoint. His roster percentage is still going to be really high, but you're going to find yourself in a lot of these simulators or projection tools without a lot of bears. And you're going to have to be okay with that. You're going to have to hope for Justin Fields to fail, Terry McLaurin to fail. I don't even think DJ Moore's roster percentage is going to be that high. 10,000 is just a lot for the number one receiver in the Bears offense. I really don't even want to say it's too high for DJ Moore because we've seen DJ Moore be incredibly productive. He's even been relatively involved with them. I mean, if you were just a casual DK fan and you're a Chicago fan and you want to throw a lineup in, you're going to look at DJ Moore and you're going to see 6.8 or 16.8 fantasy points per game, and you'll probably end up clicking on him. So maybe his roster percentage will be higher than I'm giving him credit for, but I just don't see the point in getting to him when there's so many so many more viable options on the Washington side of the ball. So enough of going through the players. Let's go ahead and build some lineups. First, I want to start with a Sam Howell build. So Sam Howell at captain. And if you're going to go Sam Howell at captain, his roster percentage is probably going to be like 14-ish% or something like that because he's so cheap and you want so many players from his offense. So it's just going to go up and up. Could see him around 14-15%, even though on a normal slate he'd be around 9 or 8. So with that being said, let's overstack him. It's going to be a common theme of mine. If I'm going to play a quarterback at captain, I'm going to overstack him because I don't want him to throw a touchdown to the 2 players in my lineup and then share first with a million other people. It's nice to win first, but you'd rather do it alone. So I want to start with kind of an expensive one and see how that works out without Justin Fields, and then we'll figure out how to fit Justin Fields in there because I think a lot of people are going to want to do that. So Sam Howell, Terry McLaurin. You're probably going to want to skip Jahan Dotson here, so let's just go down to Logan Thomas. Hit up Brian Robinson. Yeah, that works out. And then we'll want to get Khalil Herbert in there, perhaps. Let me see how much that's going to leave us with. 2,700. That's not quite enough. So let's get Khalil Herbert out of there. Go with something like Darnell Mooney. Now you have 6,300. 6,300 is always awkward because it puts you in that running back range, but that works out. So Sam Howell, Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas, Brian Robinson, Darnell Mooney, Curtis Samuel. The only thing I might do different here, let's go ahead and kick Curtis Samuel out of there and stick the Commanders in there. That feels a little bit better. Sam Howell, Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas, Brian Robinson, the Commanders. You're not really overstacking here, so what you're probably going to want to do is just go ahead and swap out Sam Howell and Brian Robinson in this lineup. So throw Brian Robinson in a captain, Sam Howell in the flex. Now you got Brian Robinson at captain, Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas, Sam Howell, Darnell Mooney, and the Commanders. Another thing that you could do here, I bet, is come down from Mooney a bit, throw Jahan Dotson in, throw back Sam Howell at captain, put Brian Robinson back in there, and then that's going to leave you enough for Johnson. No, not quite. No, not quite. So not quite enough for Johnson. Yeah, and you don't want to put Brian Robinson at captain in this lineup with 2 receivers. I guess maybe let's give it a shot. Not something that you typically do, but with the pricing on this slate, I don't think it's the worst option in the world. We'll talk through that in just a second. Still can't get Johnson in there. So that's going to be a tough one. Trying to fit in Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson was the goal there, but you're going to have to play around with that a little bit because you don't really want to go that much lower than Johnson as your run back for Chicago. Let's fit Fields in there. So Brian Robinson at captain, Justin Fields, Jahan Dotson, Sam Howell, Roschon Johnson, and that leaves you 4,000. You probably want to go a little. All right, so let's go Curtis Samuel instead of Jahan Dotson. And actually, I'd probably rather Logan Thomas over Curtis Samuel. And that leaves us 5,800. So probably Commanders. Yep. Okay, so Brian Robinson at captain, Justin Fields, Logan Thomas, Sam Howell, Roschon Johnson, Commanders. Justin Fields is a quarterback that we don't necessarily mind playing the Commanders defense with, especially since you're really, if your defense is going to hit, they're going to hit with a score, right? So Justin Fields could throw a pick 6 and still be productive in the game, especially trying to keep up as 5.5-point underdog. So that's a way you can fit Justin Fields into your lineups. You could move Sam Howell into captain, put Brian Robinson in the flex for this lineup if you really wanted to, but then you're not really stacking him or overstacking him really at all. So that's going to do it for today's Showdown coverage, brought to you by sharpfootballanalysis.com. Good luck this week, and we will catch y'all next time. Peace.